We moved into not an exclusive white neighborhood. It was just a block in from Bloomfield Avenue, the main street. And the neighbor on one side was very unhappy that blacks were moving in. But the neighbor on the other side, it didn't seem to matter. At least they spoke. But Mrs. Sigler was her name. She never spoke, even though my mother spoke to her and insisted that we speak to her. And of course we said, but she never answers. And my mother said, I'm not raising Miss Sigler, I'm raising you. And finally, she came around and started to speak.
You see, when you look like you're white, you got your foot in the door before they know it. And once you're in there, what can they say? That's how she bought the house, because she went up there and they thought she was white, and then she showed up with all these colored children.
The blockbusters came in. I guess maybe we had one African-American family moving on the block. So they went up and down the block and said, don't you want to move? And some of the neighbors called me, and we went up and down the block and we said, don't you want to stay? Most of the people stayed. We had like one or two who felt they couldn't stay.
And of course there was de facto segregation. You could not get a mortgage on a house except in certain areas. And of course South End was one of the areas where you could get it.
So redlining occurred in the 20s when builders controlled the real estate market. It became encoded in federal law during the New Deal when the government began making Federal Housing Administration loans to people to build houses. So the gradation that the real estate market used in terms of the risk of a house ranged from A to D, green to red, color-coded. So there were maps that were actually developed that would show the color coding.
There was a minister at Union Baptist Church where we belonged, which was right around the corner from where we lived. And the minister there talked to them so much about buying a home, the importance of buying property, buying a home. So many of the people who actually worked in service were able to buy a home.
Some were in construction, some were doctors. My father was a butler. Some of the kids, their fathers were chauffeurs or cooks. So they were all classes. They were hairdressers. People owned their own beauty parlors, their own cleaners. I was thinking the other day we had black pharmacists on the corner of Elliman and Bloomfield Avenue.
And there was a black home loan and something. My father belonged to one. You could put money in that and save to get a down payment on the house, and maybe even through it get your mortgage. And it was black run by businessmen and doctors and lawyers and all. And that's how they were able to save money to buy these houses.
It was set up so that the blacks bought homes here, the kids went to Glenfield School, generally speaking. Dividing line for was Lincoln Street. This side of Lincoln Street went to Nishawane. Across the street they went to Glenfield. So we had to have a house on this side of the street. He didn't want his youngsters to go to Glenfield, although he had gone to Glenfield.
Matter of fact, we went to school with white kids, mostly Italians, you know, because they lived down in that area. But soon as their parents was able to buy a house, they moved out of that area because black people was moving in. But down there at Glenfield School, when we were younger, they were friends. But when they got up Montclair High, it was a different story. So that's the way it was in those days.
I went to a school right on the borderline of Montclair, and it went to 9th grade. We didn't go to high school from that school until 10th grade. And they taught us how to make beds and how to cook and how to do all the things that you would do if you became a maid in some white person's house.
I didn't do well in high school because you weren't encouraged to, you weren't made to feel that you were capable of doing better. But when I went to Fisk, I was on the dean's list, and when I went to Montclair State, you know, I was very successful.
I'll say this, that if you were bad, bad to them meant dumb. So a lot of kids, not girls so much, but a lot of boys ended up in special ed. But they ended up in special ed because they couldn't control them. It wasn't because they weren't bright. It was just that they were bored with school, they didn't like school, so they disrupted. So rather than have you disrupt, they would say that you were special.
So while there was no segregation in terms of school buildings, there was certainly a differential and discriminatory treatment of students within the classroom. School districts actually allowed parents to do their own gerrymandering. So if you didn't like where your child was being sent to school, if you were a white parent, you didn't like where your child was being sent to school, your child could be moved out of the school and sent to another school. Black parents did not have that kind of leeway. So segregation in the schools was on the inside rather than on the outside.
Grandmother Allen became involved in anything that she didn't think was being done correctly so far as our people were concerned. And she was the one who got the first black policeman in Montclair. She was the one that integrated the line at commencement at the high school.
And the black students marched at the end of the line until 1930 when I graduated. And my mother had gone to the superintendent and the board and objected to that. So with the last name of Allen, I was number 2 or 3 in the line, and the line was completely integrated.
A lot of the guys that I went to high school with left school and were given their diplomas, you know, in their senior year anyway. And my yearbook reflects that, you know, the guys that had gone, especially the black guys. There weren't too many white guys that I recall, because a lot of the white guys went to college to avoid the war, you know. A lot of guys went, and I had 2 uncles that went. The man I married went, but he was stateside the whole war, and it's, you know, we did our part.
At that point, black doctors could not practice at the hospital. When their patients went in the hospital, they had to turn them over to a white doctor for service and practice and whatnot. Then when they were discharged, they could go back to their black doctors. So that was his number 1 priority at that point, to get on the staff, to desegregate the staff of the 3 hospitals we had then. And that happened gradually. beginning of 47, I think, was the first one.
They would get involved in protests uh, when we finally got the courage to protest.
Grunning's ice cream parlor, and there was one right next to the Claridge Theater. I can't remember the name of that one, where you knew you didn't go in there, and that was okay. We went someplace else, you know. It was Whalen's drugstore. We could always go in there and sit at the counter and have ice cream soda or what have you, you know.
You had your own stores. I mean, downtown here. I don't know whether my grandmother ever bought uptown too much, you know, and your grocery stores and your meat markets and everything.